With the increasing impacts of climate change becoming more and more clear, and with the international community struggling to implement a whole of society approach, there is a need for us, faith-based actors and organizations, to join hands and collectively unleash the full power of our faiths. Our action, the wider COP28 engagement and the pre-COP thematic discussions. Therefore, for this year's COP28, UNEP, the Muslim Council of Elders, the Interfaith Center for Sustainable Development, the International Partnership on Religion on Sustainable Development, the Episcopal Diocese of California, and the World Evangelical Alliance have formed a strategic multi-partnership with over 40 faith-based organizations and civil society partners. I can't tell you how inspiring this alliance has been to me. This group forms the Interfaith Coordination Group on climate change, and we will host a first of its kind faith pavilion at COP28. We aim to be a collaborative coordination platform to bring all faiths, genders, and ages together to catalyze more ambitious and effective action towards the climate crisis, both within our own organizations and as well on the global intergovernmental level. The news we are receiving is enormously encouraging. We are confident to obtain our pavilion, and we have already received over 100 expressions of interest to organize a session at the Faith Pavilions at COP28. And we've heard the interest of the Grand Imam and of King Charles to attend COP28 in person as religious leaders. The pavilion is historic as a physical center, but its dynamic, its energy will be even more important. The pavilion will provide a unique opportunity to raise the visibility of what faith organizations are doing to tackle the climate crisis by showcasing solutions and concrete case studies. Secondly, the Faith Pavilion will serve as a central hub for strategic engagement with key stakeholders, including negotiators and political leaders. And thirdly, it will also provide a space for the deeper layers that faith can bring, promoting multi-faith understanding and creating a space for spiritual reflection, artistic expression, and prayer. In preparation for COP28, we are running a pre-COP thematic discussion series to enhance the understanding of all our partners on the COP28 priorities and how they could contribute. This is the third of those sessions. Today, our focus is on the global stocktake, a crucial topic for COP28. Our featured speaker for this session, Dr. Maarten Kappelle from UNEP, holds extensive expertise in climate change as chief of the Scientific Assessment Branch, head of the Secretariat for the World Adaptation Science Program, and head of the Thematic Scientific Assessments Unit. His expertise will help us understand the purpose, functioning, expected outcomes, and potential actions arising from COP28. We encourage you all to actively engage in this session by asking questions afterwards and participating in the discussion. Let's make the most of this opportunity to deepen our understanding of the global stocktake and its significance in our collective efforts to address the climate crisis. Let's welcome now Dr. Maarten Kappelle to share his valuable insights on the global stocktake for COP28. Thank you, Dr. Kappelle.
Thank you, Bishop Marc, Arne, and colleagues. Let me just first of all say that it's...
I don't know if it's the Wi-Fi here at UNEP, but I cannot hear you anymore. Do others have the same problem?
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you well.
Yes,
I hear you
Maarten.
well.
Okay, so let me start again. I hope, Arne, you can also hear me. I just would like to say that it's an honor for me to be here in the Interfaith group and share some thoughts, ideas on the global stocktake today with you. Personally, I feel that there's a major role for faith-based organizations to help move forward to the climate change action agenda. And I really hope that this year at COP28, we can make a difference jointly. And in that regard, it's good to have some background knowledge of the various processes. In that regard, I'm also happy that I've been asked to present on the Global Stocktake today. And I must thank especially my colleague here at UNEP, Iyad Abu Mogli, for arranging that opportunity. So with that, I would like to share some slides with you, and I will increase the view. I hope everyone can see the view. I must say, I can no longer see you yourselves, those of you who have turned on their cameras. I'm only seeing my own slides right now. So if there's anything, Bishop Marc or Arno, anyone, you will need to speak to me because I cannot see any raised hands at this point. But of course, when I end my presentation, I will go back to the view that I can see all of you again. So with that, let me kindly start and give you an update on the global stocktake under the UNFCCC process at the Climate Change Convention, and also in relation to science and the latest assessments that we have at hand, particularly on the UNEP side. Let me go to the first slide here. Just a bit of background on what is the global stocktake. Some of you may be familiar with it, others not so much. So I thought I first introduce you to what it actually is. So this is a process that is aiming to assess collective progress around the world in implementing the Paris Agreement. We know Paris Agreement was adopted in 2015. It has three major areas: mitigation, adaptation, and means of implementation. And the means of implementation, that includes, of course, finance, the funding, and capacity and technology. That all needs to be in place as a kind of enabling conditions to make the implementation of Paris Agreement happen, particularly on the mitigation and adaptation agendas, but also now on loss and damage, which relates to adaptation and can be considered a fourth element under the Paris Agreement. Now, the first global stocktake is running from 2021 to 2023. So actually this year we are completing the first effort, and it is expected to be repeated every year. So in 2026, we would start with the second global stocktake that should then be completed in 2028. And so forth, going every 5 years. So the global stocktake is really about understanding to what extent the world is making progress in achieving the Paris Agreement's goals by 2030. Now, it is not only about climate consequences in the mere sense, in the strict sense, but particularly it also looks at social and economic consequences and response measures. As I said, also to address loss and damage issues. Now, the collective assessment takes inputs on equity into consideration, and this is really important, and I think especially also for you under the interfaith umbrella, equity is key to make sure that we leave no one behind, as we say. So we have to make use of the best available science in a cross-cutting manner and see to what extent we're actually achieving progress towards the Paris Agreement goals. Now, in the next slide here, just some information on the outcomes of the global stocktake. The idea is that the results that should be presented at the end of November, beginning of December, in the run-up to the COP and at the COP in Dubai this year, that the outcomes, the results will inform countries, particularly member states of the UNFCCC Convention. And the information would then inform the countries regarding updating and enhancing their climate actions and support, right? To what extent have we been able to make change, and where is the gap? The gap in terms of meeting the 2030 Paris Agreement goals. So this also relates to international cooperation for climate action, simply because, we cannot do everything individually, locally or nationally. We must work together regionally and across stakeholders. So cooperation is also a key element here. Now, the global Stocktake is intended to increase the ambition of the actions and support. So we have to, through the global Stocktake, explain where are the gaps, where is most action still needed, and where do we need to scale up our actions, our ambition in achieving the 2030 goal. And this relates to, of course, the 1.5 and the 2 degrees Celsius goals that we have in terms of climate change, above what are the pre-industrial levels of the 19th century in relation to carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions and so forth, right? Going forward, the outputs of the Global Stocktake will consist of key political messages and recommendations that should feed into the COP28 deliberations in Dubai, deliberations and negotiations among member states and other stakeholders, but also best practices, opportunities, and lessons learned from specific thematic areas: mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, finance, technology, and so forth. And all of this without being policy prescriptive. So it's not the plan to tell countries what to do, what policy, what action they should undertake, but it is meant to encourage countries and member states, and particularly, all kinds of stakeholders across the board, to come up with more ambitious policies and actions. All right, so in the next slide here, I'm providing a timeline of the global Stocktake. I'm not sure if you can see it very well because there's some small font here and there. But the most important thing here are the pink or red colored boxes and arrows, where you see that in 2022 or late 2021, I would say, there was a set of guiding questions for the global Stocktake being formulated for what was called the TA, which is the technical assessment of the global Stocktake. And that continued throughout the beginning of 2022. And then a series of webinars was held, and you see that in the pink colored cloud, followed by a TD1, which is the technical dialogue number 1. That one was held in Bonn last year in June at what was the subsidiary body meeting number or session number 56. And this one was followed then by TD2 and TD3. TD3 happened, the technical dialogue number 3 happened also in Bonn, by the way, in June this year. And the TD2 was in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt at COP27 in November last year. So we are now, of course, where the red arrow is, which is, well, we just passed the red arrow actually because the SB58 happened in June. We are now in August. So we are close to the end of the arrow, the pink arrow you see in the middle, where it's pointing towards the synthesis report. So that is now starting to be developed. That one should go into the COP28 CMA5 session, and I'll get to that shortly, where the synthesis report of the global Stocktake would be presented and then ready for a decision and a declaration following the consideration of outputs from the GST by the member states of the convention. So that's the timeline and the process for last year and this year, and it should be concluded at COP28. Now, in this next slide, you will see what are the components of the global Stocktake, and actually there are 3. One is the information collection and preparation that has already happened, that is completed. That information is now going into this technical assessment that is actually already completed by June, and that is now leading to that final report for consideration at the CMA5 in November in the run-up to the COP28 in Dubai. And CMA, just I put it here at the bottom of the slide. This is the Conference of the Parties serving as the meeting of the parties to the Paris Agreement. So the M is for meeting. So the conference serving as the meeting to the agreement, CMA, right? And that is happening in November, right? In the next slide, the conclusions from the subsidiary body that met in Bonn in June this year at the subsidiary body meeting number 58. They came up with conclusions from the global stocktake in the following order. And this came out of all these discussions held there. So the subsidiary body was requested in June in Bonn as follows. So the body requested the co-facilitators of the third technical dialogue to prepare two things. One, the meeting summary report by August 15, so that is happening now, that is due in the next week. And then a factual synthesis report for consideration and discussion by the 8th of September. So that is also being developed. I must say I have not seen those documents yet. They are under development, as we know, but they should be ready very soon and can then feed into the final report for consideration in November. So the Bonn meeting also took note of the views exchanged on what is called the indicative draft structure of the decision on the global stocktake, which would be adopted at the CMA 5 meeting in November. And I will show in a later slide how that draft structure would look like. Then the SB also invited parties and non-party stakeholders, and this is important because it's not just member states, parties, you know. By the way, parties are not only member states. We know the European Union is a party, but not necessarily a single member state, but rather a grouping of 27 members. But non-party stakeholders are also requested to submit views, and I presume some of you might be in one way or another involved in that effort. Submitting views on those elements for consideration of the output. So that would need to be happen by September, the submission of views. Then the SB also requested the Secretariat to prepare the synthesis report on these submissions, and that should be ready for an intersessional workshop in October in the run-up to the November-December COP meetings, right, when the output should be considered. Okay, so that's like the process from June till November, more in detail. We need to have the summary report, the factual synthesis report, reviewing and receiving, first of all, the views of parties and non-party stakeholders, and then finally get the synthesis report. Now, how does the draft structure of the decision look like? So the global stocktake should lead to this report that would have a following structure. Of course, there's a preamble in which there would be references to the Paris Agreement, to the need to measure progress towards the 2030 goal and so forth. Then, of course, context, cross-cutting considerations, also, of course, recognizing the reports that have been out there, and IPCC reports will be heavily mentioned, of course, but also the various UNEP reports to which I will refer in the second part of this presentation. And then collective progress. So this is a very important part, collective progress towards achieving the purpose and long-term goals of the Paris Agreement. This refers to Article 2, and it is in the light of equity and the best available science. And this is really a key element, best available science. We are talking here about peer-reviewed journal articles by top scientists in the best journals and books available. That would then form the basis for the scientific assessment that would feed into the global stocktake, of course. And this should inform parties in updating and enhancing in a nationally determined manner action and support. Of course, international cooperation will be discussed for climate action and the way forward as well. Now, the third section, as it is explained here on collective progress, would include subsections, 5 in total. Logically, there would be mitigation and adaptation, as well as finance, but also loss and damage and response measures. And response measures are really important, a key area of interest, because the response measures are really about how we can respond to climate change in the best way possible. Now, the global Stocktake outputs will then be considered, as I said before, in November 2023. Actually, at CMA 5, not at number 6. Now, here at UNEP, and that's the other part I would like to present here. Here at UNEP, we provide inputs to the global Stocktake. We have 2 reports that you may or may not be familiar with. The emission gap report and the adaptation gap report. And the emission gap relates to mitigation, and the adaptation gap report, of course, to adaptation. So these 2 reports tackle the 2 main pillars of the global Stocktake, mitigation and adaptation. And here in front of you, you see the front covers of these 2 reports as we published them in 2022. So what we do here is we have kind of annual reports that we present often in the run-up to the COP. So they're currently for 2023 under development. So I cannot show those yet because we are working on them. They're not ready, but they will be ready in October, November, and can further provide inputs to the global Stocktake process. But the 2022 reports are definitely captured in the global Stocktake because they're available already. So on the left side, you see the emission gap report front cover. It shows the closing window of opportunity that we have and that we must act upon quickly. And on the right side, you'll see the adaptation gap report front cover, which is talking about too little, too slow. Too little action, too slow action is leading to climate adaptation failure, and this is putting the world at risk. Now let me go to the next slides. First, I will speak about the emission gap report, the key element of the global Stocktake. So this report is calling for rapid transformation of societies. We're talking about the energy transition, of course, but many other transformations that need to happen to phase out greenhouse gas emissions. Now, the report has been produced since 2010, so we have around 13 or 14 editions already on an annual basis that have been feeding into the COPs every year. Now, the key questions of this report on mitigation, on emissions gap, is, 2 key questions are: what progress has been made in ambition and action since COP26 in Glasgow? And of course, this year we look at the changes in progress in terms of ambition and action since COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh last year. But in general, because we have 14 reports in a row, we can easily see what ambition and action have been undertaken since the Paris Agreement in 2015. So we'll look into that, and that is information that is of key value to the global Stocktake. Then the second question that we addressed last year was, how can the necessary economy-wide transformations be initiated and accelerated? So here what we do is we conduct an assessment. We look at global greenhouse gas emissions. What is the status? What are the trends? We look at the nationally determined contributions that countries provide to the UNFCCC convention. What net zero emissions pledges countries have made. Some countries say they will be pledging to net zero emission by 2040 or 2050 or later. Particular interest is in progress on G20 members, because G20 members are the main emitters of greenhouse gases, of course. The US, China, India, European Union, Russia, Brazil, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, etc., etc., UK. So we'll get to that. Then the emissions gap in 2030, implications for temperature increase, and finally the needs and options to initiate and accelerate transformations of all these various sectors in society, including the financial system. Right, so let me show you this slide where you see total global greenhouse gas emissions, that have been setting records in 2021 and probably also in 2022. And we need to look at 2023 next year, but it doesn't really look good. The rate of growth in greenhouse gas emissions has been slowing down between 2000 and 2009, but then again increasing after 2019. And even though COVID, as you may see, had a kind of dip in 2020 in this graph, the lines are going up again. And this applies particularly to carbon dioxide because methane and nitrous oxide emissions remained relatively steady during 2019, 2020, and 2021. So the lines are going up and we continue to emit. Now here you can see for the highest emitters, the per capita greenhouse gas emissions for those 7 largest emitters, USA, Russian Federation, China, Brazil, Indonesia. They have the largest amount of tons of carbon dioxide equivalents per capita per individual per country. So that is quite worrisome. Now here I got a few more slides with similar information. I will not go too much into detail because I have more slides and I know you will have some questions. But the emissions associated with both household consumption and public and private investments, if you look at all of this, the bottom 50% emit an average of 1.6 ton carbon dioxide equivalent per capita. So, there are large inequalities within and between countries, but still, the numbers are high and worrisome. Now, also, if you look at the historical cumulative emissions, they're also very unequal. So inequality is a key element here that might be of interest to you. How can we bridge that? How can we make sure that we really lower these numbers? So 25% for the US, when we look at contributions to historical cumulative emissions, and 1% Brazil. And by the way, that's mostly forest fires. Anyway. Then, if you look at new and updated nationally determined contributions, there's modest progress since COP26, but still, you see the colors here. The dark green ones have no newer updated NDCs submitted. So some countries like Kazakhstan or Turkey or Algeria, Afghanistan, Syria, they have not been able to provide new NDCs. And still, in red, you can see newer updated NDCs that are equal or higher emissions relative to initial NDCs. So those are not really very good as we would like to see it. So there's a lot to be done here. Still very worrisome. We need to upscale our ambitions. Now here's another slide. I will not go into the detail here, but bottom line is that collectively and if fully implemented, new and unconditional NDCs would result in annual reduction of global greenhouse gas emissions. But progress since COP amounts to about 1.5 gigatons. That's not really a lot. So much more needs to be done here. And by the way, you see in red, I'm not sure if you can see it. I will try to put my cursor here. There's a red area here, which corresponds to Brazil, which is the forest fires we had under the previous administration. Now, so collectively, countries are not on track to achieve their NDCs, and this is causing an implementation gap, right, for the G20 members. major problem here. They're currently projected to meet their NDC targets and have not either updated the original ones, right? And then all other G20 members need additional policies. So globally, the gap for 2030 implementation gap is estimated to be around 3 gigatons carbon dioxide equivalents. So really large numbers here. Countries are not on track to achieve their NDC. So this will be one of the main results of the global stocktake. We are not on track towards 2030. Now, just a quick slide on the emissions gap in 2030, which remains high. You see a number of 1.5 degrees range, 1.8, 2 degrees. But if you look here, I'm not sure if you can read it well, but it says in blue, current policy scenario. So this is where we are at this point. Actually, we are, of course, in 2020, we are near here. If you can see my cursor, which is around 56 or so gigatons, but we are on the way to 58 by 2030. While in order to have 1.5 degrees, we should be around 35 at most, and for 2 degrees around 40 gigatons. So we are around 23 gigatons over where we should be in terms of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. So we are not doing a very good job here. And a 45% reduction is needed to get on track to 1.5 and 30% reduction to get on track to 2.0 degrees. So it is very worrisome. So there's lack of progress, and this is leaving the world on a path towards global warming far above the Paris Agreement goal. So I will not go into a lot of detail here, but just if you look at the right side, without further strengthening of the ambition, we are on the way to global warming of 2.8 degrees, right? Of course, there's a range between 1.9 policies and actions as planned towards 2030 and beyond. This is very worrisome. Okay, I will skip this one, which is a lot of detail per country. Here you can see their emission trajectories implied by NDCs and net zero targets. But if you don't, if you're okay, I would like to skip this one because it takes too much time. But let me quickly focus on this one. This is on large-scale, rapid and systemic transformation that is now needed, because this is about the actions that we really need in supply, industry, transportation, buildings, and so forth. We have to plan for a just transition. We need to go to zero emissions for all kinds of sectors of the industry. We have to expand electric vehicles. We must build zero emission buildings and so forth. So there's a lot of actions that we need to take into account and focus on to avoid what is called lock-in. So we have to walk away from fossil fuel subsidies, avoid unsustainable solutions, avoid inefficient buildings, and avoid delay above all. Right. And then also on food systems, there's a similar discussion ongoing, because a lot of food systems emit a lot of greenhouse gases. A lot of emissions come from that sector. Therefore, it is necessary to transform food systems to address climate change. For instance, still deforestation is happening in South America, for instance, to create lands for cattle or ranching, for meat production. But if we would change our food system, that would not necessarily be done. So there's a lot to cut down on in the food sector. Then the financial system, just quickly, very complex graph. I will not go into the detail, but we need to realign the financial system as an enabler of transformation. And this will cost $4 to $6 trillion annually. So quite large amount of money are involved here to really make that transition and transformation happen. Okay, so just at the bottom here, kind of final message in conclusion on the emission gap, on mitigation. Every fraction of a degree matters, hence so does every ton of greenhouse gas emissions reduced. We must reduce greenhouse gases. Now let me quickly go to the other report, adaptation gap report, and then we'll open it up for some questions. So this report, which is the other one that is feeding into the global stocktake on adaptation, is telling the world that action is too little, too slow, and putting the world at risk. So also for this report, we had several iterations on an annual basis, already 7 over the past since 2014. We didn't have one at every COP. In 2019 and 2020, we did not produce a report also related to COVID in 2020. But let me go into the 2022 report details. The report looks at what has been done to adapt until date and to what extent is climate risk being reduced. So here we have a focus on adaptation planning, financing, and implementation, those three, as well as effectiveness of adaptation and interlinkages with mitigation. So these are like 5 areas that we look at in this report. Well, these are graphs that are relatively well known. They come from IPCC, from the assessment report 6 by working group 2, where you can see the global surface temperature change, but particularly the reasons for concern, as it is called. So there's major problems here. On the right, it says that IPCC is saying the world will face severe climate risks, even under low emission scenarios. And we've already seen that this year with all these records being broken in June and July, with July being the hottest month on record globally during the times that we have been measuring temperatures. Right. Then adaptation has to be center stage alongside mitigation because climate change is locked in, it's happening. So we must reduce emissions on one side, but also we must take action on the adaptation side and prepare ourselves for climate change, build resilience and reduce vulnerabilities. And then ultimately we must address increasing losses and damages, particularly in vulnerable countries, in developing countries that suffer the most. Okay, so this is just a slide showing where national plans on adaptation are in place. So just a few countries do not have them yet. Venezuela and Bolivia in the Western Hemisphere, Saudi Arabia and Iran in the Middle East, and some other countries have work in progress, but it is still challenging for some areas. But many countries do have some plans by now. Now, in terms of finance, adaptation finance has to be included in the national adaptation plans of developing countries. This has been done in some countries, not in others. As you can see, some countries do have it included, others have not. So there's a discrepancy, and we need to work towards equity and ensure that finance is included in adaptation plans across the board. And if you look at the finance gap itself, on the right side, you'll see that $29 billion were available for adaptation in 2020, but the cost is, between 160 and 340 billion. So, hundreds and hundreds of billions are needed by 2030 and even more by 2050. So we are not investing enough in adaptation. And doubling of the 2019 finance flows by 2025 would require strong acceleration. This was agreed in Glasgow during the COP a few years ago. Now, this is a kind of complex graph. I will not go into too much detail now, but it's just telling us that the implementation of adaptation is not keeping up with climate impacts. So the action we are taking to implement adaptation is not meeting the need in view of the climate impacts, the extreme weather events that we see around the world. Last year we saw these floods in Pakistan. Now the last few weeks, floods in Slovenia. We see heat waves in the Mediterranean with temperatures over 40 degrees. And this is affecting, of course, crops, and people are suffering. I think we're all aware of all of it. So we must implement and make sure adaptation is in place as soon as possible in view of all these climate impacts. Now, if we look at adaptation practice itself, what has been done so far, the level is still poor, although we must follow best practices, but it hasn't been done yet in order to improve effectiveness. So sometimes we do adapt, but the adaptation is not adequate, is not effective, and is not helpful. In some cases, it leads even to what is called maladaptation, which is a form of negative adaptation, which is totally unhelpful. Now, just quickly on the mitigation linkages, what are the interlinkages between adaptation and mitigation from the outset? Well, it results that some climate solutions effectively reduce climate risk, contribute to mitigation. Nature-based solutions, for instance, can provide synergies between adaptation and mitigation, because if you would plant trees, you could stop tsunamis along the coast, you could reduce the impact, and at the same time you're capturing carbon, for instance. So you should look at these win-win situations and capitalize upon those. And then also address trade-offs that might be there as well. Okay, so in conclusion here, adaptation progress is too little and too slow. Global efforts are increasing, but not enough. We need to accelerate our adaptation efforts, and we must build from the outcomes of COP26 and COP27. And now, of course, looking forward to COP28. So strong political will is necessary to avoid climate action from being sidelined because of other major crises. Okay, I think that's all for now. I thank you for your attention, and I will stop sharing here and take some questions. And I apologize for that it was perhaps a bit too long, but I wanted to give a good overview of what information feeds into the global Stocktake, also from the UNEP side. Back to Bishop Marcus and my colleague Arne.
Dr. Kappelle, that was not too long. It was impactful. It was concise. What a great presentation. Sobering, of course, but thank you. I believe we already have some questions in the chat. I believe one has shown up. Does the global Stocktake consider only state actions, or also multinational corporations that are most of the problem? And that was from Arthur Dahl.
Thank you. Yeah, let me start. Let me go one by one, if that's okay. So the global Stocktake engages member states to the convention and also non-party stakeholders. So the private sector is an important player, right? We must look at the private sector. We must engage with the private sector. And at UNEP, we have also done so in the past, looking at the private sector and their investments. And actually, we are producing this year, and I did not present it because last year we did not have this in place, what is called the Production Gap Report. I'm not sure, perhaps some of you might have heard it. It has been produced by the Stockholm Environment Institute in collaboration with UNEP. And the Production Gap Report looks at the fossil fuel production gap. What does it mean? We need to phase out fossil fuel production. We have to phase it out, right? So we have to look at what needs to be done between now and 2030 to meet the Paris Agreement goal by phasing out fossil fuel production. So this gap report looks at both member states, countries, but also at private companies, at the private sector, to see what are their intentions, what are their policies and plans regarding phasing out fossil fuel production. And what we see is in the past few years, particularly actually since last year, we see an increase in fossil fuel production, also because of the war happening in Ukraine. which triggered an energy crisis globally. And because of that, many countries are now again increasing their efforts to produce fossil fuels, while they are also betting on green energy transitions, right? So that must be taken into account in the global stocktake. The global stocktake itself looks mostly at what member states do, but the member states, of course, have also national policies on fossil fuel production, which relate directly to the private sector. So indirectly, this is being taken into account. I hope that answers the question.
That's an excellent answer. Dr. Kappelle, Dan asks this question. In terms of taking stock, he is curious whether there is an analysis of the qualitative, how, in addition to the what. In other words, we are measuring what has happened, but he says we need to know why it has happened. And more importantly, I think the center of his question is, how has political will been generated to create the positive changes in the gap reports?
Well, that's a very good question. I think that's more for scientists. You know, let me first of all say that the UNEP process is, although it is a political process negotiated through member states, the UNEP Secretariat and the UN do not mingle with internal national country member state issues, right? So we are not assessing political will ourselves. That is beyond our mandate. But of course, the academia can assess political will in countries and come up with scientific evidence that that political will is lacking left or right, and needs to be beefed up and increased. Right, but political will is a bit of a sensitive matter because it relates to administrations in countries, and that's an area that not necessarily we have a mandate ourselves to assess. But of course, scientists can assess that in a neutral manner. But qualitative analysis, social research qualitatively is very important. Because we can look at plans and policies and see to what extent they really try to make a difference. So in that regard, you can do a kind of assessment. But what we do, we base our assessments and analysis on published research, right? So we are, and then we're talking about peer-reviewed reviews or articles in journals and that are renowned and established and recognized as such. But there's work for social scientists on that side. Thank you.
Definitely. And I would just say that your own work and the work of the many scientists who are part of the IPCC system, I think that is partly how the political will is being generated, is making good science available in a way that can be consumed by political actors. I think that's partly how this happens. So, we're grateful for that. Professor Aditi Michal asks, towards the advocacy, can UNEP help us to prep with advocacy deck, with a deck, which we can present and reach out to our members globally? And also, can we make a system where we train a certified army towards climate action? But I'll say the answer to the last part is a definite yes. But UNEP, Dr. Kappelle and Ayad and Arne and Miriam and others, there's a question whether a kind of deck can be prepared that has these graphics and information that is useful in reaching out to members of these different organizations that are with us today.
Yeah, well, that's a really good question, and I can answer that positively. First of all, let me say that I shared the slides I showed with Arne Oosterlink here on the call, and I suggested that he's welcome to share the slides with all of you. This is public information, so you should get the slides through Arne. That is one. Secondly, and I have to defer to my colleague Iyad Abu Mogli here on the call, who represents UNEP in this interfaith group. And we can work from our side with Iyad and other colleagues, including Mr. Nicholas Hagelberg, our subprogram coordinator for climate change. We do have all kinds of communication assets, right, that have been developed by the communication division at UNEP. And those are publicly available. We're talking here about information for social media, all kinds of, there's even an interactive web story that can be downloaded from the website. If we can coordinate this through Iyad, I'll be happy to work with some colleagues and or work with Arne here as one of the facilitators to point you to the right people in our organization to get access to the social media assets that we have and other products that can be downloaded that you can use in your own advocacy, spreading the word, to say it that way.
Thank you. That's very encouraging. Iyad himself has a question.
If I could make a small addition to this. Indeed,
Yes, please,
are
Arne.
very open. We will work together with Maarten to share the resources that are already available, and also specifically for COP28, we are at the moment looking to hire a PR firm, and together with them, we will make a deck for the people that will be present at COP28, but also that are not present physically or that can be present virtually, to spread these messages and to help you with this.
That's great, really great. Thank you, Arne. Iyad himself has this question for you, Dr. Kappelle. Does the Stocktake look at fossil fuel production differently than fossil fuel consumption? And then he makes the statement, production is in countries that are not necessarily high consumers.
That's a very good one. And, of course, there's one great example, which is Australia still producing a lot of coal being exported to parts of Asia and consumed there. So it's produced in one country and consumed in others, in India and China. China is a producer, but also an importer, as we know, of fossil fuels. So you definitely need to separate between those. We ourselves have not looked into what we could call the consumption gap. Like, are we on track in terms of reducing fossil fuel consumption towards 2030? That would be a very interesting issue to look at. But you have to separate both, of course. You can look at it in a combined manner, but you really need to assess the fossil fuel consumption side of things. But, indirectly, the emissions gap report looks at consumption, because if you consume fossil fuels, you will be emitting carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. Mm-hmm. So the emission gap report is a kind of proxy for the consumption side of fossil fuels, right? In that regard, that report can be helpful, but it would be good to do a separate assessment on the same. Thank you for raising the point, Iyad.
Yeah. And here's, I think, the last question. There are a couple more, but we're almost out of time. Joyce De Silva asks, does the global Stocktake link deforestation to industrial farming, which is greedy for livestock feed, such as soya?
Yeah, well, actually, that is exactly what we have been doing. And I had a slide, but I did not go in detail, where we talk about what is called LULUCF, which is land use change, land cover change, forest, reforestation, afforestation, the whole package. But it includes agriculture. So we look at deforestation in relation to farming, because we know in South America, in Brazil, in Argentina, there's a lot of soy production in areas that used to be forested, right? And the same happens with palm oil in Southeast Asia, and Malaysia, and Indonesia, on the island of Borneo and Kalimantan, and etc. So Sumatra, we are very much aware of that, and the science has been looking into that, and we take that into account when we look at that particular sector, the agroforestry sector, or the agriculture/forestry sector, right? So yes, we take that into account for the global Stocktake.
Fantastic. The very last question, we won't be able to address it, but it's incredibly important for this particular forum. What are some opportunities for faith-based organizations to engage with each other further as we take this message back to our congregations and communities? This is, to the point of why we have come together. Please stay tuned. We are working towards this physical pavilion, which is a certainty at COP28 in Dubai, but it really is a process, even more than it is a physical accomplishment, which is building on the really very vital interconnections between faith bodies who are already doing climate action and have been doing so for decades. So we're intending to, as Christiana Figueres urged us to do, raise the ambition on what faith-based bodies can do by connecting better with each other and learning from each other what our different faiths and in our different locations have led us to do as climate action. I always use Bhumi Project, Bhumi Global, as an example. With a Hindu base, there's a great emphasis on plant-based diets and solutions, which by itself has an enormous impact. And many people, not Hindu, not part of Bhumi, endorse this, but it comes out of a certain focus from them, and we can learn from each other. So stay tuned, and thank you so much, everyone, for taking part. Arne, do you want to make an announcement about the future? In other words, other of our sessions. Oh, you're muted.
You're muted.
And now, can you hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. So thank you again all so much for being here with us and trying to co-create this process. We will have other sessions. As you probably know, we try to have these monthly sessions or having this multiple times a month to inform, to share information on what exactly the COP28 priorities are, and also the gaps or opportunities that are present for faith-based organizations. So definitely keep an eye on your inbox, and more invitations for these will be coming. If you're very interested to collaborate and to seek partners and other ways to engage in this interfaith process for climate change, for COP28, but also after COP28, please do not hesitate to send me an email, and we're very happy to see what is possible and where we can connect you with. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We look forward to seeing you in the future, and we look forward to a hopeful future fueled by climate action.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Maarten. Thank you very much. All the best.
Bye-bye. Thank you.